The golden revolving doors of the Grand Kong Royal Hotel spun shut with a heavy whoosh, but Nia wasn't walking through them. She was being shoved. Her heels scraped against the icy pavement as she stumbled backward, her folder of papers flying into the air and scattering across the wet, muddy snow. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, but the sting of humiliation hurt far more. Manager Kim, a man with a perfectly pressed suit and a cruel sneer, stood in the doorway like a guard dog, pointing a shaking finger at her. He shouted for everyone on the busy street to hear that they didn't hire people who looked like her, that her dress was cheap, and that she was probably there to steal towels, not to work. Nia dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather her wet resume, her hands trembling not just from the freezing temperature, but from pure terror. She had $7 in her bank account, a hungry 7-year-old daughter waiting at home, and this housekeeping job was the only lifeline she had left. Tears blurred her vision as she looked up at the towering glass building that felt like a fortress she was forbidden to enter. Suddenly, the hum of a powerful engine silenced the busy street. A long, sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted so dark they looked like black mirrors. The hotel doorman, who had been watching Nia's struggle with amused smirks, instantly snapped to attention. Manager Kim's angry face transformed into a mask of oily, desperate politeness as he bowed low, almost touching his nose to his knees. The back door of the limousine opened with a smooth click. First, a polished black shoe stepped out onto the slushy red carpet, followed by a leg clad in trousers that cost more than Nia's entire apartment. Then the man emerged. He was tall, terrifyingly handsome, and radiated a cold power that made the air feel heavier. He buttoned his cashmere coat and looked toward the entrance, but his eyes didn't stop on the bowing manager. They stopped on Nia. Nia froze on the ground, clutching her ruined papers. Her heart stopped beating for a second. She knew those eyes. She knew that face. It was impossible, but she was certain. Those were the same sad, desperate eyes of the smelly, shivering homeless beggar she had sat next to on the street just last night. The man she had given her very last meal to. The CEO of the Kong Empire looked down at her, and for a moment, the world stood still. Manager Kim noticed the CEO staring and quickly stepped forward, nervously laughing that he was just taking out the trash. The CEO turned his head slowly, his voice deep and dangerous as he repeated the word trash with a tone that sounded like a thunderclap before a storm, terrified Manager Kim to his core. Stop. Before we find out what the CEO does next, I need to know where you're watching this story from. Are you in Lagos? New York? London? Seoul? Drop your city in the comments below right now. This is the most important aspect of this story because kindness can happen anywhere. Now let's go back 24 hours to see how a billionaire ended up begging on the street and how a woman with nothing saved his life. 24 hours earlier, the city of Seoul was buried under a blanket of white snow. High above the frozen streets, in a penthouse apartment that touched the clouds, Tae-Yong Kang stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. He was the wealthiest man in the city, the owner of the Kong Royal Hotel and hundreds of restaurants, but his eyes were empty. It was his 35th birthday, and his phone had been buzzing all morning. But the messages weren't saying happy birthday or I love you. They were messages from his uncle asking for a loan, his stepmother asking for a new villa, and his cousins asking for promotions they didn't deserve. Tae-Yong realized with a heavy heart that if he lost his money today, not a single person in his life would stay by his side. They loved his wallet, not him. He turned to his assistant, Mr. Lee, who was holding a schedule for a fancy birthday dinner. Tae-Yong shook his head and canceled everything. He told Mr. Lee that he was tired of the lies and the fake smiles. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to know if there was any real kindness left in the world, or if everyone was just as greedy as his family. Tae-Yong went to the back of his closet and pulled out a box he had kept for years. Inside were old, ripped clothes he used for painting. He put on the stained trousers, the jacket with holes in the elbows, and a beanie hat that smelled like mothballs. He rubbed some charcoal from the fireplace on his cheeks to make his skin look dirty and tired. Mr. Lee tried to stop him, warning him that it was 10 degrees below zero outside, but Tae-Yong was determined. He said the cold would reveal the truth, and he walked out of his luxury apartment and into the harsh winter night. Across the city, in a tiny basement apartment that smelled of damp concrete and old cooking oil, Nia Adebayo was counting coins on a small, scratched table. 1, 2, 3, she counted all the way to $10. That was it. That was every penny she had in the world. Her 7-year-old daughter, Zuri, was sitting on the mattress on the floor, wrapped in 3 blankets because the heating had been turned off 2 days ago. Zuri looked up with big, hopeful eyes and asked if there was dinner tonight. Nia's heart broke into a million pieces. She forced a bright smile, hiding the panic rising in her throat, and told Zuri that tonight was going to be special. She lied and said she was going out to get a surprise because she had a big interview the next morning at the Kang Royal Hotel. She promised Zuri that when she came back, she would bring the best dinner ever, maybe even fried chicken. Zuri squealed with delight, her hunger momentarily forgotten by the promise of a treat. Nia kissed her daughter's forehead and grabbed her thin, worn-out coat. It wasn't nearly warm enough for the Korean winter, but it was all she had. She told Zuri to stay in bed and keep warm, and that Mrs. Kim next door would be listening out for her. Nia stepped out into the dark, freezing alleyway. She knew she couldn't afford fried chicken. She could barely afford rice. But she was a mother, and she would starve herself before she let her daughter go to bed with an empty stomach. She began the long walk toward the city center, hoping to find a cheap convenience store where her money would stretch further. Meanwhile, Tae-Yong was sitting on the icy concrete sidewalk outside one of his own 5-star restaurants, the Golden Spoon. The smell of garlic butter steak and warm bread wafted out every time the door opened, making his empty stomach cramp with pain. He wasn't pretending to be cold. He was freezing. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and his lips were turning blue. He held out a dirty paper cup to the people walking by. These were wealthy people, people wearing fur coats and leather boots, people who had just spent hundreds of dollars on dinner. A man in a business suit walked past, talking loudly on his phone. Tae-Yong recognized him as one of his own board members. He croaked out a plea for help, just a coin for hot water, but the board member didn't even look down. He swerved around Tae-Yong as if he were a pile of garbage and muttered for him to get a job. An hour passed, and Tae-Yong felt his hope dying along with the feeling in his toes. 2 young women in party dresses came out of the restaurant giggling, holding half-eaten pastries. Tae-Yong looked up and asked if they could spare the bread. One of the women looked at him with pure disgust, wrinkled her nose, and tossed the pastry into the wet slush next to him, laughing that she missed the trash can. Tae-Yong stared at the ruined food in the snow, a single tear freezing on his cheek. He had his answer. The world was cruel. There was no love, only greed. He decided he was done. He was about to stand up, call his driver, and go back to his tower of ice, ready to fire everyone and shut his heart forever. But then, he heard the soft clip-clop of broken shoes. He looked up and saw Nia. She was walking fast, her head down against the wind. She looked different from the other people on the street. She was black, with skin that glowed under the streetlights, but she looked exhausted. She was hugging her thin coat around herself, shivering almost as much as he was. Nia was heading to the convenience store on the corner, her mind busy calculating math. If she bought 2 rice balls and 1 instant soup, it would cost $4. That left $6 for the bus to her interview and back. It was a tight budget. If she spent $1 extra, she would have to walk 5 miles in the snow tomorrow. Nia saw the man sitting on the curb. He was curled into a tight ball, shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He looked like a pile of rags that the city had forgotten. Nia walked past him. She told herself to keep walking. She told herself she couldn't save everyone. She had Zuri to think about. She had $10 to her name. She took 5 steps past him, but then she heard him let out a small, painful whimper. It was the sound of a human being who had completely given up. Nia stopped. She closed her eyes and remembered her grandmother's voice, saying that when you close your hand to give, you also close your hand to receive. She turned around and walked back to the shivering man. Tae-Yong flinched when he saw her shadow, expecting another insult or a kick. But when he looked up, he didn't see disgust. He saw pain and kindness. Nia asked if he was okay, her breath making a cloud in the cold air. Tae-Yong grumbled for her to go away, testing her, saying he didn't want her pity. But Nia shook her head and said nobody is fine sitting in the snow. She turned and walked into the convenience store. Tae-Yong watched her go, thinking she was just another person ignoring him. But 5 minutes later, the doors opened, and Nia came out holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and a plastic bag with hot food. She walked straight to Tae-Yong and did something that shocked him to his core. She didn't drop the food in his cup. She didn't hand it to him and walk away. She sat down next to him, right there on the dirty, wet, freezing pavement. She ruined her stockings and got mud on her coat, but she sat shoulder to shoulder with him. She handed him a coffee and a warm box of premium beef rice. Tae-Yong looked at the food. It smelled like heaven. He asked her what this was, and she simply said it was dinner. She told him to drink the coffee to warm his blood. Tae-Yong took a sip and felt the heat spread through his frozen fingers. He looked at her suspiciously and asked why she was doing this, asking if she wanted something from him, because he had no money. Nia laughed, a rich, musical sound that seemed to warm the air around them. She told him he looked like he needed a friend more than a bank. She opened her own box of food, but it was the cheaper tuna version. She had bought him the expensive beef meal. She told him to eat because hard times don't last, but strong people do. Tae-Yong took a bite, and for the first time in years, he felt a lump in his throat that wasn't from anger. He asked her where she was from, and she told him about Nigeria and her daughter Zuri. Tae-Yong asked if she shouldn't save this money for her daughter. Nia stopped eating for a second and looked at the street lamp, saying quietly that she had enough for Zuri. Tae-Yong pressed her, asking if she spent her last money on him. Nia turned to him and looked him deep in the eyes. She said that if she couldn't help him when she had little, she wouldn't help him when she had plenty. She told him her grandmother taught her that you never know who you are helping. You could be helping an angel in disguise. Tae-Yong felt shame burn his cheeks. He wasn't an angel. He was a billionaire pretending to be poor to judge people, and here was a woman with nothing judging him worthy of her last resources. They ate in silence, a comfortable silence that Tae-Yong had never experienced in his loud, busy life. Finally, Nia stood up and dusted the snow off her coat. She said she had to go because her little girl was waiting. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out $2 bills. Her last $2. She pressed them into Tae-Yong's hand and told him to get inside somewhere warm tonight, even if it was just a laundromat. Tae-Yong tried to refuse, standing up and saying he couldn't take it, but Nia insisted. She smiled and told him to just pay it forward one day. She turned and began to walk away into the swirling snow. Tae-Yong looked at the 2 crumpled bills in his hand, then at the empty food box. She had spent everything. He did the math. The beef bowl, the coffees, the cash, she had nothing left. She was walking home in the snow because she couldn't afford the bus anymore. He called out for her to wait, but the wind howled too loudly, and Nia vanished around the corner. Tae-Yong stood there, the shivering replaced by a fire in his chest. He reached into his ripped pocket and pulled out a sleek, waterproof smartphone. He dialed his assistant, Mr. Lee, his voice no longer weak, but commanding and powerful. He ordered Mr. Lee to bring the car around. Mr. Lee asked if he should pick him up, but Tae-Yong had a different order. He told Mr. Lee that he needed to find a Nigerian woman with a 7-year-old daughter named Zuri who lived in this neighborhood. Mr. Lee asked if she had stolen from him, but Tae-Yong looked at the spot where Nia had sat in the mud and whispered that she hadn't stolen anything. She had saved him. Nia walked for 45 minutes, her feet numb and her nose stinging, but her heart felt light because she had done a good thing. When she finally got to her apartment building, she saw something taped to her door. It was a bright red piece of paper that looked like a warning sign. Nia's hands shook as she ripped it off the door and read it under the flickering hallway light. It was an eviction notice. It said she had 24 hours to pay $800 in outstanding rent or vacate the premises. If she didn't leave, the locks would be changed tomorrow at 6 p.m. Nia dropped the paper, leaning against the wall as she slid down to the floor. Tomorrow. She had $0. She had an interview, but even if she got the job, she wouldn't get paid for 2 weeks. Mommy? The door opened, and Zuri stood there in her pajamas, holding a small teddy bear. She asked if Nia had brought the chicken. Nia quickly wiped her tears, stood up, and forced a smile that felt like her face was cracking. She lied and said the chicken shop was closed, but that she made some special rice balls. She walked into the apartment and closed the door on the cruel world outside. She didn't know that across the city, the man she had fed was currently screaming at his private investigators to find her name. She didn't know that her act of kindness had just started a chain of events that would shake the entire city. But for now, all she knew was that she had 24 hours before she and her daughter were homeless. The alarm on Nia's cracked phone buzzed against the cold concrete floor at exactly 6 a.m., but Nia was already wide awake. She hadn't slept a wink. Every time the wind howled outside the tiny basement window, she jumped, thinking it was the landlord coming to kick them out early. She sat up and saw her breath turn into a white cloud in the freezing air. Beside her, little Zuri was curled up under 3 thin blankets, shaking slightly in her sleep. The heating had been turned off 2 days ago, and the apartment felt like an icebox. Nia's stomach twisted with a sharp pain. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning because she had given that expensive beef bowl and her coffee to the homeless man. Regret tried to creep into her mind, whispering that she should have kept the food, but she pushed it away. She looked at Zuri's peaceful face and whispered a prayer.
Today had to be the day.
Today, she had to get that job. She gently woke Zuri up, forcing her voice to sound happy and full of energy. She told Zuri that today was the big day, the day Mommy would become a superstar at the big hotel. Zuri rubbed her sleepy eyes and asked about the fried chicken Nia had promised. Nia felt a lump in her throat, but she smiled and promised that tonight they would have a feast. She helped Zuri get dressed in her school uniform, layering 2 sweaters underneath to keep her warm. Then Nia went to her own closet. She had only one good outfit left, a black skirt and a white blouse that she had ironed carefully. But as she put it on, she saw a small, faint coffee stain on the collar from when she had hugged the shivering man last night. She tried to scrub it with water, but the mark stayed. She sighed, putting on her thin, worn-out coat. It would have to do. After dropping Zuri off at school with a tight hug, Nia turned toward the city center. The calm Royal Hotel was 5 miles away. Usually, she would take the bus, which cost $2.50. But her pockets were empty. She had given her last $2 to the stranger in the snow. Nia tightened her scarf, took a deep breath of the biting air, and started to walk. The wind was brutal. It whipped against her face and cut through her thin coat like a knife. After the first mile, her toes went numb. After the 3rd mile, she couldn't feel her feet at all. The slush on the road had soaked through the holes in her shoes, wetting her socks with freezing mud. But she kept walking. She thought about the eviction notice taped to her door. She thought about Mr. Rossi coming at 6 p.m. to change the locks. She walked faster, ignoring the pain. When the calm Royal Hotel finally came into view, Nia felt like she was looking at a castle from a fairy tale. It was a tower of glass and gold that touched the gray sky. Golden statues of lions guarded the entrance, and doormen in red velvet coats opened the doors for guests stepping out of shiny cars. Nia felt small. She felt dirty. She tried to smooth down her frizzy hair and wipe the mud off her shoes, but it just smeared. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors, and the warmth of the lobby hit her instantly. It smelled of fresh jasmine flowers and expensive perfume. A crystal chandelier the size of a car hung from the ceiling, sparkling like diamonds. Nia walked to the front desk, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. The receptionist looked up, her eyes scanning Nia's wet shoes and tired face with a look of pure judgment. When Nia asked about the housekeeping interview, the receptionist didn't even smile. She simply pointed a manicured finger toward the back door, telling Nia that service staff belonged in the alley, not the lobby. Nia swallowed her pride and walked back out into the cold, finding the service entrance near the smelly dumpsters. She walked down a long, gray hallway until she found the waiting room. It was packed with 20 other women. They all looked perfect. Their clothes were crisp, their hair was neat, and they were chatting confidently in Korean. When Nia walked in, the room went silent. Everyone stared at her wet coat and the puddle forming around her shoes. She found a chair in the corner and sat down, opening her folder to check her resume. A kind woman next to her whispered, asking if she was okay, because she was shaking so hard. Nia admitted she had walked, and before the woman could respond, the door banged open. Mr. Kim, the hiring manager, walked out holding a clipboard. He was a short man with slicked-back hair and a face that looked like he smelled something bad. He shouted Nia's name, butchering the pronunciation. Nia stood up quickly, her legs feeling weak from the long walk and hunger. Mr. Kim didn't invite her into his office. He just stood there in the middle of the crowded waiting room, looking her up and down with a sneer. He told her she was late. Nia checked the clock on the wall. It was 5 minutes before 9. She politely told him she was early, but Mr. Kim narrowed his eyes. He didn't like being corrected by someone who looked like her. He told her she looked messy and that a housekeeper must be invisible and spotless. He said she stood out too much. Nia tried to defend herself. She told him about her 5 years of experience at the city hospital, about how fast and honest she was. Mr. Kim scoffed at the word honest. He snatched the resume from her hand, glanced at it for a second, and then deliberately dropped it on the dirty floor. He laughed and said he was clumsy, while the other women in the room giggled nervously. Nia bent down to pick up the paper, and as she did, her empty stomach let out a loud, growling roar that echoed in the quiet room. Mr. Kim laughed cruelly, asking if she was here to work or to steal food from the guests. He called her a beggar. Nia stood up, her face burning with shame, but her eyes fierce. She begged him for a trial, promising to clean the lobby right now to prove herself. She told him she had a daughter to feed. Mr. Kim grabbed her arm tightly, shouting that he didn't care if she had 10 daughters. He dragged her toward the exit, not the back door, but through the main hallway toward the front entrance, wanting to humiliate her completely. He shoved her through the revolving doors and onto the cold pavement where the rich guests were arriving. Nia stumbled and fell to her knees in the snow, her papers scattering everywhere again. Mr. Kim stood over her, shouting for everyone to hear that they don't hire thieves and that she should get out before he called the police. Nia felt the eyes of strangers burning into her. She was at rock bottom. She had failed. Zuri was going to be homeless tonight. Tears hot with frustration spilled down her cheeks as she tried to gather her wet resume. Then, silence fell over the bustling entrance. A sleek black car had pulled up and a man had stepped out. Nia looked up through her tears and froze. Standing on the red carpet, looking down at her, was the homeless man from last night. But he wasn't shivering anymore. He was wearing a suit that looked like it was made of silk. His hair was perfectly styled. He radiated power and wealth. It was Tae-Yong Kang,
The CEO.
Manager Kim didn't notice Nia staring. He immediately bowed so low he looked ridiculous, sweating and stammering greetings to the CEO, trying to explain that he was just removing trash from the hotel. Tae-Yong didn't look at his manager. He walked right past him, his eyes locked on Nia. He reached down, picked up her wet resume from the snow, and shook it off. He read it calmly, then looked at the trembling manager Kim. He asked why Mr. Kim had thrown the resume of an impressive candidate on the ground. Mr. Kim stuttered that she didn't fit the look. Tae-Yong stepped closer, his voice booming so the crowd could hear. He asked if the look was someone who was hungry, someone who had walked 5 miles in the snow just to work. Then, Tae-Yong did something that made the doorman gasp. He took off his $5,000 cashmere coat and wrapped it gently around Nia's shoulders. The warmth was instant, smelling of cedar and safety. Mr. Kim shrieked that he shouldn't put such an expensive coat on her, but Tae-Yong turned to him with eyes as cold as ice. He told Mr. Kim and everyone listening that last night he had been on the street pretending to be homeless. He said hundreds of rich people walked past him and spat on him. But this woman, who had nothing, spent her last dollar to feed him. He said she had more class in her little finger than Mr. Kim had in his entire body. He fired Mr. Kim on the spot, ordering security to drag the screaming manager away. Tae-Yong reached out his hand to Nia. She took it, and he pulled her up, leading her into the hotel like a queen. Nia felt like she was floating in a dream as they rode the private elevator to the top floor. Tae-Yong's office was bigger than her entire apartment building, with walls of glass overlooking the city. He ordered his assistant to bring hot chocolate and pastries. Nia drank the warm chocolate, feeling life return to her body. Tae-Yong sat behind his massive desk and told her he knew about her situation. He knew about the eviction. He opened a drawer, wrote a check for $10,000, and slid it across the desk. Nia stared at the check. It was enough to solve all her problems. It was a miracle, but she didn't pick it up. She looked at Tae-Yong and shook her head. She told him she couldn't take it. She explained that she didn't help him to get paid, and if she took the money, it would make her kindness look like a transaction. She said she wanted a job, not charity. She wanted to earn her dignity. Tae-Yong smiled, impressed by her spirit. He ripped up the check and told her she was hired, but not as a housekeeper. He needed a personal assistant to handle his difficult family. He offered her a salary of $5,000 a month, plus housing in the staff estate where Zuri would have her own room. Nia couldn't breathe. It was perfect. She accepted with tears in her eyes. Tae-Yong stood up, ready to take her to get Zuri and move them in immediately. Just then, his phone rang with a harsh, loud tone. Tae-Yong's face went pale. He answered it on speaker. It was his stepmother, screaming at him to turn on the TV. Tae-Yong grabbed the remote and turned on the news. Nia gasped. On the giant screen, a grainy video was playing on a loop. It showed Tae-Yong in his dirty rags from last night, sitting on the curb, talking to himself and eating from a plastic box. The headline flashed in bright red letters. Breaking news. Billionaire CEO goes insane? Spotted begging on streets. The news anchor was speaking frantically, saying that stockholders were panicking and the board of directors was calling an emergency meeting to remove him for mental instability. Tae-Yong dropped the remote, his hand shaking. His stepmother screamed over the phone that his cousin, Min-ho, had followed him and filmed it. Min-ho was setting him up to steal the company. Tae-Yong looked at Nia, panic filling his eyes. A minute ago, he was the savior. Now his world was collapsing. Before they could move, the office doors flew open. Large security guards in dark suits marched in. Behind them walked a man who looked like Tae-Yong but with a cruel, twisting smile. It was his cousin Min-ho. He sat on the edge of Tae-Yong's desk and laughed, saying the board had just voted to suspend Tae-Yong for being crazy. He ordered the guards to take Tae-Yong's phone, his wallet, and his keys. Tae-Yong tried to fight, shouting that he was the CEO, but the guards held him back. Min-ho looked at Nia with a sneer, calling her the homeless girlfriend, and accusing her of trying to trick a crazy man out of his money. He ordered the guards to throw them both out. The guards grabbed Tae-Yong and Nia, shoving them toward the elevator. As the doors closed, Min-ho waved goodbye with a wicked laugh. They were dragged down to the back alley and thrown onto the wet pavement. The heavy metal door slammed shut and locked. Tae-Yong stood up, checking his pockets. They were empty. No money. No phone. No home. He slumped against the brick wall, defeated. He looked at Nia and whispered that he was sorry. He had promised to save her, but now, he had lost everything too. They were both on the street, and the snow was starting to fall harder. The heavy steel door of the Kang Royal Hotel slammed shut with a deafening clang that echoed through the narrow, garbage-filled alleyway. The sound was final, like a prison cell locking. Tae-Yong stood up slowly from the wet pavement, his $5,000 suit now stained with grease and mud. He rushed to the door and pounded on it with his fists, screaming for them to open up, screaming that he was the owner, but the only answer was silence. He patted his jacket pockets frantically, hoping to find his phone, his wallet, or even his car keys, but they were empty. Min-ho's guards had taken everything. In a matter of minutes, he had gone from the king of Seoul to a man with absolutely nothing. No money, no identity, and no power. He slumped against the cold brick wall, sliding down until he hit the ground and buried his face in his hands. The shame was burning him up inside. He had promised to save Nia, to change her life, but instead, he had dragged her down into his nightmare. Nia stood a few feet away, brushing the dirt off her worn-out coat. She didn't scream and she didn't cry. She was used to hard knocks. She was a survivor. She looked at the broken man on the ground. A few minutes ago, he was a billionaire offering her the world. Now, he was just a frightened man shivering in an alley. She walked over to him and extended her hand. Tae-Yong looked up, his eyes red and hopeless, and asked where they could possibly go since he had no money to help her pay the landlord. Nia's voice was steady as she told him that they had nowhere to go but her place. She checked the cracked watch on her wrist and said she had to pick up Zuri from school in 3 hours, and they still had a home until 6 p.m. when the landlord would kick them out. Tae-Yong shook his head, saying he couldn't go with her because he was ashamed, but Nia grabbed his hand firmly. She told him that he had been attacked, not defeated, and reminded him of her own words. Hard times don't last, but strong people do. Tae-Yong looked at her rough, hard-working hand, the only lifeline he had left, and he took it. The walk to Nia's apartment was long and humiliating. Tae-Yong kept his head down, feeling the eyes of strangers staring at him. He looked ridiculous, a man in a tuxedo suit walking through the poorest part of the city, his shoes clicking on the cracked sidewalks. They arrived at the crumbling brick building where Nia lived, and she led him down the dark, narrow stairs to the basement unit. When she unlocked the door, the smell of damp concrete and old pipes hit Tae-Yong's nose. The apartment was tiny, just one room with a mattress on the floor, a small plastic table, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was freezing inside, maybe even colder than the street. Nia didn't apologize for it. She hung her bag on a nail and told him to sit down while she made tea. Tae-Yong sat on the lumpy mattress and looked around. He saw drawings taped to the wall, colorful crayon pictures of a little girl and her mother under a yellow sun. One drawing said, "To Mommy, I love you." Tae-Yong felt a lump in his throat. He lived in a penthouse with 10 rooms and expensive art, but he realized he didn't have a single thing in his life that was made with love like those drawings. Nia handed him a chipped mug of hot water with a tea bag floating in it. They sat in silence for a moment, the steam rising between them. Tae-Yong finally spoke, his voice low and serious. He explained that Minho wasn't just going to steal the company, he was going to destroy it. He told Nia about the emergency board meeting happening that night at 8 p.m., where they would vote to make Minho the permanent CEO. Nia asked how they could stop him, and Tae-Yong's eyes narrowed as his sharp business mind started to work again. He told her about the golden files, a secret digital key his grandfather had left him. It was a USB drive that proved he owned the majority shares and could override the board's vote. But the problem was the drive was locked in a safe deposit box at the central bank, and he needed his fingerprint and retinal scan to open it. Without his phone or ID, and with Minho watching the bank, it seemed impossible. Before Nia could come up with a plan, the door burst open with a bang. It wasn't the police or the landlord. It was a small whirlwind of energy in a school uniform. Zuri ran in, dropping her backpack, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the stranger sitting on her bed. Tae-Yong froze. He didn't know how to talk to children. His own family had never been affectionate. Zuri looked at his fancy, muddy suit, then at his sad face. She walked right up to him, staring with big, brown eyes that looked exactly like her mother's. She asked if he was the man Mommy helped. Tae-Yong nodded slowly, feeling unworthy of looking at her. Zuri smiled, reached into her pocket, and pulled out a small, bright orange tangerine. She told him he looked sad and offered him her snack. Tae-Yong took the small fruit, his hands trembling. He realized that for 30 years his family had only tried to take things from him, but this little girl who had almost nothing was giving him her food. Tears welled up in his eyes as he whispered a thank you. Nia clapped her hands to break the heavy mood, telling Zuri to do her homework because she and Mr. Kang had a mission to get the bad guys. The afternoon passed quickly, and the shadows in the basement grew longer and darker. At 5:55 p.m., the mood in the room shifted from planning to panic. Nia began pacing, checking the clock every few seconds. She whispered to Tae-Yong that the landlord, Mr. Rossi, would be there any minute and he didn't care about excuses. Suddenly, a heavy fist pounded on the door, shaking the thin wood. Zuri yelped and ran to hide behind Nia's legs. A gruff voice shouted for Nia to open up. Nia took a deep breath, told Tae-Yong to stay out of sight, and opened the door. Mr. Rossi stood there, a large man with a thick neck and a mean face, flanked by two movers. He demanded the $800 rent immediately. Nia stood in the doorway, blocking his view, begging for just one more day, promising she had a new job and could pay double next week. Mr. Rossi spat on the ground, saying he had heard it all before, and signaled the movers to clear the place out. Tae-Yong couldn't watch this happen. He stepped out of the shadows and walked into the hallway light. He adjusted his suit jacket and stood tall, projecting the authority of a CEO. He announced his name, Tae-Yong Kang, and ordered Mr. Rossi to give Nia an extension. Mr. Rossi blinked, looking at the suit, then at the mud. And then he laughed, a loud, barking laugh that echoed in the hallway. He recognized Tae-Yong from the news, calling him the crazy homeless guy who got fired. Tae-Yong tried to negotiate, promising to wire $10,000 tomorrow, but Mr. Rossi poked him in the chest hard, telling him his credit was frozen and he was worth less than the dirt on the floor. He shouted for the movers to get them out. The men pushed past Nia and Tae-Yong. They grabbed the mattress, tossed the table, and ripped Zuri's drawings off the wall. When one mover grabbed Zuri's teddy bear, Tae-Yong lunged at him, shouting for him to put it down, but the large man simply shoved Tae-Yong backward. Tae-Yong hit the wall and slid down, gasping for breath, realizing his physical strength was nothing compared to these men. 10 minutes later, the three of them were standing on the sidewalk. The sun had set, and the snow was falling harder now. Beside them was a pathetic pile of plastic garbage bags containing Nia's clothes and Zuri's few toys. That was it. That was their entire life. Zuri was crying softly into Nia's coat. Tae-Yong sat on the wet curb, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. He felt like he had hit rock bottom. He looked at the snow and whispered an apology to Nia, saying she should have left him at the hotel because he had only brought her bad luck. Nia finished wrapping a scarf around Zuri's head and turned to him. She reached down, grabbed his silk tie, and pulled him up until his face was inches from hers. Her eyes were blazing with a fire that scared him and inspired him at the same time. She told him to listen. She admitted they were homeless, cold, and hungry, but she pointed at Zuri and said she was still standing. She pointed at herself and said she was still standing. She smoothed his lapel and told him that he had spent his whole life afraid of people wanting his money, but now that he had no money, the only thing left was him. She asked him if he was a king or just a wallet. Tae-Yong stared at her, and something inside him clicked. The fear shattered. He wasn't a wallet. He was the man who built an empire from nothing. He looked down the street and saw a delivery truck parked outside a shop. It had the logo Kong Foods Delivery on the side. It was one of his trucks. The driver was walking out of a shop with a coffee. Tae-Yong smiled, a dangerous wolfish smile. He told Nia they didn't need a disguise. They needed a Trojan horse. He asked if she could drive a stick shift. Nia grinned, wiping a snowflake from her nose, and said she used to drive a minibus in Lagos. She could drive anything. Just as they were about to move toward the truck, a black SUV swerved around the corner, drifting on the ice. It slammed on its brakes right in front of them, blocking their path. The doors flew open, and 4 men in black masks jumped out holding baseball bats. Minho hadn't just fired Tae-Yong. He had sent a hit squad to finish the job, so he couldn't make the meeting. One of the thugs pointed his bat at Tae-Yong and shouted that the boss wanted his legs broken. Tae-Yong stepped in front of Nia and Zuri. He had no guards, no weapon, and no phone. But he didn't back down. He told Nia calmly to take Zuri, run to the truck, and start the engine. Nia screamed, asking what about him. Tae-Yong raised his fists, ready to fight for the first time in his life, and said he was going to buy them some time. The metal baseball bat swung through the freezing air with a terrifying whoosh, missing Tae-Yong's head by only an inch. It smashed into the brick wall behind him, sending red dust flying into the snow. Tae-Yong didn't have time to think. He ducked and tackled the masked thug around the waist, driving him backward onto the slippery ice. But Tae-Yong was a businessman, not a street fighter. He had spent his life in boardrooms, not back alleys. Another thug kicked him hard in the ribs, and Tae-Yong gasped, curling up in pain on the wet asphalt. He looked up through one swollen eye to see two men towering over him, raising their bats for a finishing blow. He closed his eyes, waiting for the crack of bone, praying that Nia and Zuri had made it to the truck. He was ready to pay the price for his failure. Suddenly, a blinding white light flooded the alleyway. The roar of a diesel engine screamed like an angry beast.
Rum.
The massive Kong Foods delivery truck didn't just start, it launched forward. Nia hadn't run away. She had hot-wired the truck in seconds, a trick she learned back home when keys went missing, and slammed her foot on the gas. The truck barreled toward the thugs, its massive bumper looking like the mouth of a shark. The men screamed and dove into the piles of snow to avoid being crushed. The truck screeched to a halt right next to Tae-Yong, the passenger door flying open. Nia leaned across the seat, her eyes wide and wild. She didn't look like a terrified mother anymore. She looked like an action hero. She screamed for him to get in. Tae-Yong scrambled up, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs, and threw himself into the cab of the truck. Before he could even shut the door, Nia slammed the gear stick into reverse. The truck's tires spun on the ice, smoking, then caught traction. They shot backward out of the alley, clipping the side of Minho's black SUV with a loud crunch of tearing metal. Zuri was sitting on the floor of the truck between the seats, hugging her teddy bear and wearing a seatbelt Nia had improvised from a delivery strap. Nia spun the heavy steering wheel with one hand, swinging the giant truck around in a perfect 180-degree turn. She slammed it into second gear, then third, speeding down the snowy street while the thugs scrambled to get back into their damaged SUV. Tae-Yong stared at Nia, his mouth hanging open. He was clutching his bruised side, but he forgot the pain for a second. He watched her shift gears, check the mirrors, and weave through the heavy Seoul traffic like she was driving a sports car, not a 3-ton food truck. He asked her where she learned to drive like that. Nia kept her eyes on the road, checking the rearview mirror, where the black SUV was starting to catch up. She grinned, a fierce, determined look on her face, and told him that if he could drive a minibus in Lagos traffic during rush hour, he could drive anything on Earth. She swerved sharply to the left, cutting off a taxi and forcing the pursuing SUV to slam on its brakes to avoid a crash. They turned a sharp corner, the back of the truck sliding dangerously on the ice before straightening out. Tae-Yong looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 6:45 p.m. The emergency board meeting was at 8 p.m. They had 1 hour and 15 minutes to save his life. He told Nia to head for the central bank downtown. He explained that Minho would have men watching the front entrance, waiting for a man in a suit. But they were in a Kong Foods truck. To the guards, they would just look like the evening delivery crew bringing coffee and donuts to the night shift staff. It was a crazy plan, but it was the only one they had. Nia nodded and pressed the gas pedal harder. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the loading dock behind the massive stone building of the central bank. Tae-Yong's heart was pounding. This was the most dangerous part. If the guards checked the manifest, they would see there was no delivery scheduled. If they looked too closely at Tae-Yong's face, they would recognize the crazy ex-CEO. Tae-Yong grabbed a Kong Foods cap from the dashboard and pulled it low over his eyes. He found a spare delivery jacket in the back seat. It was 2 sizes too big and smelled like old onions, and put it on over his ruined suit. He told Nia to stay in the truck with Zuri, to keep the engine running.
Nia grabbed his arm.
She told him no. She said he was hurt, holding his ribs, and barely walking straight. She said she was coming with him. They walked up to the security checkpoint at the loading dock. Tae-Yong pushed a metal cart filled with empty boxes he had found in the back, trying to hide his face. 2 armed guards stood by the scanner. One of them, a bored-looking man with a coffee stain on his shirt, held up a hand. He asked for ID. Tae-Yong froze. He didn't have ID. He didn't have a delivery pass. He felt sweat trickling down his back despite the freezing cold. He was about to panic, about to run, when Nia stepped in front of him. She put on a bright, annoyed face and started talking fast and loud. She complained about the snow, about the traffic, and about how her new guy, pointing at Tae-Yong, was an idiot who forgot the paperwork in the truck. She demanded to know if they wanted their special boss donuts now or if she should take them back to the kitchen. She acted so confident, so bossy, that the guards just wanted her to stop talking. The guard rolled his eyes, beeped the gate open, and told them to hurry up before he changed his mind. They were in. Tae-Yong let out a shaky breath. He looked at Nia with pure admiration. She had just talked their way into the most secure building in the city, with nothing but attitude. They abandoned the cart near the elevators and sneaked down the marble hallway toward the private vaults. The bank was mostly empty. The lights dimmed for the night. Tae-Yong limped, his side burning with every step. They reached the vault room. It was a massive wall of steel boxes. Tae-Yong went to box 707. He didn't need a key. He needed himself. He placed his right thumb on the scanner.
Beep.
Access granted. He leaned forward and let the red laser scan his eye.
Click.
The heavy metal drawer popped open. Inside, sitting on a velvet cushion, was a small, silver USB drive. The golden files. The proof that Minho was a fraud and that Tae-Yong still owned 51% of the company. Tae-Yong grabbed it, clutching it like a diamond. He felt a surge of hope. He had it. He could fix everything. He turned to show Nia, a smile breaking across his bruised face. But the smile vanished instantly. Standing at the end of the hallway, blocking the exit, were 3 bank security guards. And standing behind them, holding a phone to his ear, was Manager Kim, the man Tae-Yong had fired from the hotel that morning. Minho had hired him. Manager Kim pointed a shaking finger at them and screamed that they were robbing the bank. The alarm bells began to ring.
Clang. Clang. Clang.
Red lights flashed in the hallway. Tae-Yong grabbed Nia's hand. They couldn't go back to the loading dock. It would be swarming with police in seconds. He looked around frantically. There was only one other way out, the fire escape that led to the roof, but it was 4 flights up. He looked at Nia. She didn't hesitate. She kicked off her high heels so she could run barefoot. They sprinted for the stairs. Tae-Yong's ribs screamed in agony, but adrenaline pushed him forward. They burst onto the snowy roof of the bank, the cold wind hitting them like a hammer. Below, they could hear sirens wailing. Police cars were surrounding the building. They were trapped. Tae-Yong ran to the edge of the roof and looked down. It was a 3-story drop to the alleyway below. But in that alley, sitting with the engine running, was the delivery truck. And on the roof of the truck was a thick layer of snow. Tae-Yong looked at Nia. It was crazy. It was impossible. But it was the only way. He asked her if she trusted him. Nia looked at the drop, terrified, but then she looked at the USB drive in his hand, the key to their future. She nodded. Tae-Yong grabbed her waist. They counted to 3. And they jumped. For a second, they were flying through the freezing night air. Then whump. They landed hard in the deep snow on top of the truck. The impact knocked the wind out of them, but the snow cushioned the fall. They rolled off the roof and onto the hood, then down to the ground. Zuri screamed from inside the cab, unlocking the doors. They scrambled inside just as the police burst onto the roof above them, shining flashlights down into the darkness. But they were too late. Nia slammed the truck into gear, and they roared away into the night, disappearing into the city traffic before the cops could spot their license plate. 7:45 p.m. The calm Royal Hotel was glowing like a beacon in the night. Limousines were dropping off the board members for the emergency meeting. Inside that building, Minho was preparing to steal Tae-Yong's life. In the truck, the mood was tense. Tae-Yong was pale, shivering violently from shock and pain. His suit was ripped, he was covered in snow, and he looked like a madman. Nia looked at him. She reached into the back and grabbed a clean, white chef's coat from a laundry bag. It wasn't a suit, but it was clean. She helped him put it on, buttoning it up over his bruised chest. She told him that clothes didn't make the king. The man made the king. She cleaned the blood off his lip with a napkin. They pulled up to the front of the hotel. But it wasn't empty. A wall of police officers and private security guards blocked the entrance. Min-ho had locked the building down. He had told the police that his crazy cousin was coming to attack the meeting. If Tae-Yong stepped out of the truck, he would be arrested immediately. He wouldn't make it 5 steps. Tae-Yong looked at the blockade. He looked at the USB drive in his hand. He was so close, but he couldn't get in. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, tears of frustration filling his eyes. He whispered that it was over. He couldn't get past an army. Nia stared at the police barricade. Then she stared at the massive glass windows of the hotel lobby. She looked at the heavy steel bumper of the delivery truck. She looked at Tae-Yong. She asked him one question. Does this truck have insurance? Tae-Yong looked at her, confused. He nodded slowly. Nia smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a mother who was done being pushed around. She told Zuri to hold on tight to her teddy bear. She told Tae-Yong to brace himself. She shifted the truck into low gear and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared like a dragon. The truck didn't stop at the barricade. It smashed through the wooden sawhorses, scattering the terrified security guards. Nia didn't aim for the door. She aimed for the wall of glass.
Crash.
The sound was deafening. Glass shattered like rain as the 3-ton truck plowed straight into the lobby of the Kang Royal Hotel, skidding across the marble floor and coming to a halt right in front of the golden elevators. Guests screamed and ran. Dust and debris filled the air. Silence fell for a second. Then, the driver's door opened. Nia stepped out, shaking glass from her hair. She marched around to the passenger side and pulled the door open. Tae-Yong stepped out. He looked wild, dangerous, and unstoppable. He held the USB drive in the air like a weapon. He looked at the stunned security guards who were too shocked to move. He didn't run from them. He walked past them, toward the elevators. Nia walked beside him, holding Zuri's hand. They looked like a family going to war. Tae-Yong pressed the button for the penthouse boardroom. The doors opened. 7:59 p.m. Upstairs, Min-ho was raising a glass of champagne. To the new CEO, he toasted, smiling at the board members. And to my cousin, may he find peace in the asylum. He picked up the golden pen to sign the papers that would transfer the company to his name. The pen touched the paper.
Ping.
The elevator doors at the end of the boardroom slid open. Min-ho looked up annoyed. He expected security. Instead, he saw a ghost. Tae-Yong stood there, wearing a chef's coat, bleeding, covered in dust, with a furious Nigerian woman and a little girl by his side. Min-ho dropped the pen. Tae-Yong stepped into the room. You're sitting in my chair, he whispered. The crystal chandelier in the penthouse boardroom didn't sparkle anymore. It seemed to hold its breath. 20 of the most powerful men and women in Seoul sat frozen in their leather chairs, their mouths hanging open as they stared at the door. They were used to seeing Tae-Yong Kang in Italian silk suits, commanding the room with a whisper. They were not used to seeing him in a stained, oversized chef's coat, his face bruised and bloody, standing next to a fierce woman holding a child's hand. The silence was so heavy you could hear the wind howling outside the shattered windows of the lobby 50 floors below. Min-ho, who had been seconds away from stealing the empire, dropped his golden pen. It clattered onto the mahogany table, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. His face twisted from shock into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He stood up slowly, smoothing his suit, trying to regain control of the room. Min-ho let out a cruel, barking laugh that echoed off the walls. He pointed a shaking finger at Tae-Yong and shouted to the board members to look at him. He called Tae-Yong a lunatic, a madman who had finally snapped. He asked them if this was the man they wanted leading a billion-dollar company, a man who broke into his own hotel with a delivery truck, looking like he had just crawled out of a dumpster. The board members murmured nervously, looking at Tae-Yong's dirty clothes and the wild look in his eyes. They were scared. They began to nod in agreement with Min-ho. Security guards from the hallway finally caught up, rushing into the room with their guns drawn, surrounding Tae-Yong, Nia, and Zuri. The situation looked hopeless. Min-ho grinned, sensing victory. He ordered the guards to arrest the intruders for domestic terrorism and to take the child to social services. Nia felt Zuri tremble beside her. Her motherly instinct flared up like a lioness protecting her cub. She didn't wait for Tae-Yong to speak. She stepped forward, right in front of the gun barrels, shielding Tae-Yong and Zuri with her own body. Her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the tension. She told the room that clothes did not make a man, and a suit did not make a leader. She pointed at Min-ho and said he was wearing a $10,000 suit, but inside, he was a thief and a coward. She pointed at Tae-Yong and said he was wearing rags because he fought for his life, because he had been beaten and stripped of everything, yet he still came back to protect his legacy. She asked the board members if they wanted a CEO who looked perfect while stealing from them, or a CEO who would walk through fire to save the truth. Her words hit the room like a hammer. The board members stopped nodding. They looked at Nia's fierce eyes, then at Tae-Yong's determined face. Tae-Yong stepped past Nia, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder to thank her. He walked straight toward the head of the table, ignoring the guards who were shouting at him to get on the ground. He didn't look like a crazy person anymore. He looked like a king reclaiming his throne. He locked eyes with Min-ho. Min-ho sneered and lunged for the phone to call the police commissioner, but Tae-Yong was faster. He slammed the silver USB drive, the golden files, onto the table. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply told the tech director, a nervous man named Mr. Park, to plug it in. Min-ho screamed no, trying to grab the drive, but Tae-Yong shoved him back with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Mr. Park, terrified of disobeying the true owner, plugged the drive into the main projector. The massive screen behind Min-ho flickered to life. It didn't show numbers or spreadsheets. It showed a video. The room gasped. It was a security recording from Min-ho's own office, dated 3 weeks ago. In the video, Min-ho was sitting with the corrupt district attorney and manager Kim. They were laughing. The audio was crystal clear. Min-ho was bragging about his plan. He detailed exactly how he hired actors to pose as beggars to harass Tae-Yong. He explained how he paid the news station to run the fake story about Tae-Yong's mental breakdown. And then, the worst part, Min-ho laughed about skimming $50 million from the company pension fund to pay for his takeover. He called the board members stupid sheep who would follow anyone with a nice suit. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the boardroom was terrified. Every single board member slowly turned their heads to look at Min-ho. These stupid sheep were now wolves, and they were angry. Min-ho's face drained of all color. He backed away, stammering, trying to say it was a deep fake, that it was a lie, but the evidence was undeniable. Tae-Yong crossed his arms and asked the board who the real criminal was. Before Min-ho could answer, the elevator doors pinged open again. This time it wasn't a ghost. It was the chief of police, followed by 6 officers. They had been called by Min-ho to arrest Tae-Yong, but they had walked in just in time to see the video playing on the screen. Min-ho saw the police and pointed frantically at Tae-Yong, screaming for them to arrest him, claiming Tae-Yong crashed a truck into the lobby. The chief of police looked at Tae-Yong, then at the screen, then at Min-ho. He walked past Tae-Yong and stopped in front of Min-ho. He pulled out a pair of silver handcuffs. He told Min-ho that while crashing a truck was a crime, stealing $50 million and framing a CEO was a much bigger one. He clicked the cuffs onto Min-ho's wrists. Min-ho screamed and kicked as he was dragged out of the room, shouting threats that he would be back, but nobody was listening. The king of the last few hours was gone. Tae-Yong stood at the head of the table. He was bleeding, dirty, and exhausted. He looked at the board members. They all stood up, one by one, and bowed their heads in shame and respect. They apologized for doubting him. They offered to call a doctor. But Tae-Yong didn't care about their apologies. He turned away from them and looked at the 2 people who actually mattered. He looked at Nia and Zuri standing by the door. He walked over to them and knelt down on one knee in front of Zuri. He told her that he had a promise to keep. He wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek and smiled, saying they had a dinner to get to. 6 months later, the snow had melted and the cherry blossoms were blooming in Seoul. The calm Royal Hotel was busier than ever, but things had changed. The doorman no longer turned people away based on how they looked. The hiring policy had been completely overhauled. And every Friday, The leftover food from the five-star restaurants was not thrown in the trash. It was packed into vans and delivered to the homeless shelters across the city, a program called the Nia Initiative. In the penthouse apartment, the morning sun streamed through the windows. It wasn't a cold, lonely place anymore. There were colorful crayon drawings taped to the expensive marble walls. There were toys scattered on the Persian rugs. In the kitchen, Tae-Yong was wearing an apron over his casual clothes. He wasn't the cold CEO anymore. He was humming a song as he flipped pancakes. Sitting at the island counter was Zuri, wearing a bright new school uniform, swinging her legs and laughing. Next to her sat Nia. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform or a worn-out coat. She was wearing a beautiful, professional suit. She was no longer just an assistant. She was the director of the Kang Foundation, running the charity programs that helped thousands of people. Tae-Yong placed a stack of pancakes in front of Zuri and then a plate of, yes, fried chicken in the middle of the table. He had kept his promise. They had fried chicken every week. Nia sipped her coffee, looking at the man who had changed her life and the man whose life she had saved. She remembered the cold night on the street, the eviction notice, the fear. It felt like a lifetime ago. Tae-Yong poured himself a coffee and sat down next to them. He reached out and took Nia's hand. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. It said that hard times don't last, but love does. The doorbell rang. It was Mr. Lee, the faithful assistant who had returned to work. He came in holding a magazine. On the cover was a picture of Tae-Yong, Nia, and Zuri standing together, smiling. The headline read, "The King, the Queen, and the Heart of Seoul, How Kindness Saved an Empire." Zuri grabbed the magazine and giggled, pointing at herself. She said she looked famous. Tae-Yong laughed, a real, deep laugh that filled the room. He looked at Nia and said that the magazine was wrong. He wasn't the king. He pointed at Nia and said she was the one who taught him how to lead. Nia squeezed his hand and smiled, reminding him of what her grandmother always said, that sometimes the person with the least has the most to give. They sat there, a family formed not by blood, but by a single act of kindness on a freezing winter night. They had lost everything to find each other, and in the end, they had gained the world. Thank you for watching this incredible journey. This story proves that no matter how dark it gets, a little bit of light can change everything. If you loved Nia's bravery and Tae-Yong's transformation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have so many more amazing stories coming for you. Question of the day: what is the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. See you in the next video.
Bye.